tape what was prophesied so many ancient days ago, that the Eternal said that His people in the latter days that we would free the slaves. And I say that this was fulfilled through Lincoln. But also, there's another type of slavery, serfs, where everybody wants to run down the czars, Christian rulers. But I don't believe the mentality of the people today. They have the remotest idea of what a great empire, a handful of dramatic people who went up through the Caucasus Mountains. This is where we get the word Caucasian. And we find through the Caucasus Mountains, they went in through the steppes of Russia. There's a plaque today that says the Trail of Israel and so forth. But we remember the promises of the Eternal to Abraham. Out of thy loins shall come all the great nations of the earth. Out of thy loins shall come all of the kings, of the great kings. And the czars, like them, good, bad, and different, whatever. They were some kings. They were great men. They ruled over a mighty empire until they quit listening to the Eternal. But we find, and I won't go into it at this time, but see, the adversary never, ever forgets. Our Civil War was to have been America's Bolshevik Revolution, putting us in slavery to world international bankers and the world Jewry, if you like. But through divine intervention and this old country boy Lincoln, who they made a dupe out of, but at the last moment he woke up. And this was, there's another book written, Lincoln, Money Martyred. He was killed later on over the issue of money because they thought, well, we lost the war, these world international bankers of Europe, the Rothschilds and those. Well, we'll go back. We can still capture America and take it over, just like they have done. Later on, Lincoln issued the greenback dollar. He refused to borrow money at usury from Europe. And so he borrowed it from the people. This was why he was killed. And you see, and I'm sure a lot of you have read and heard and saw the great parallel between Lee Harvey Oswald, and both Lincoln and the Kennedys had a vice president named Johnson that took over at their death. And it's not the intent of my story, but I would like to go back for any of you who want to maybe go back and write down this, I think, very valuable historical lesson and information that you've probably never heard of or ever will again or see anywhere written down. But we left off where Benjamin had escaped back to England, where he later died. Now, continuing, quoting, the good Tsar, Alexander II, has been responsible on September 19, 1861, by imperial decree, for emancipating the Russian serfs, in number over 47 million. Serfdom was ended by the stroke of a pen. Now, I'm deviating from my quote here, but you see, by the stroke of a pen, accomplished through the descendant of Abraham, these Christian czars. Now, back to quoting again. But in the United States, it took billions of dollars and oceans of blood to free these 3 millions, not serfs, but slaves, because of the infamous plot of English and European money. Bismarck knew the truth, and he revealed it in 1876 to this German, Conrad Siem, S-I-E-M, who published it in La Ville, France, number 216, March 1921. 45 years later, Bismarck wrote, now the title of the next paragraph, Bismarck told a story in 1876. The division of the United States into two federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the high financial power of Europe. These bankers were afraid of the United States, or these bankers were afraid the United States, if they remained in one block as one nation, would attain economical and financial independence, which would upset their financial dominion over the world. The voice of the Rothschilds predominated. They foresaw a tremendous booty if they could substitute two feeble democracies indebted to the Jewish financiers to the vigorous republic, confident and self-providing. Therefore, they started their emissaries in order to exploit the question of slavery and thus to dig an abyss between the two parts of the republic. Lincoln never suspected these underground goings-on, I'm trying to say. He was anti-slaverist, and he was elected as such, but his character prevented him from being the man of one party. When he had affairs in his hand, he perceived that these sinister financiers of Europe, the Rothschilds, wished to make him the executor of their design. They made the rupture of the North and the South imminent. The master of finance in Europe made their rupture definitive in order to exploit it to the utmost. Lincoln's personality surprised them. His candidature did not trouble them. They thought too easy dupe. The candidate woodcutter, but Lincoln read their plots and soon understood that the South was not the worst foe, but the Jew financiers. He did not confide this apprehension. He watched the gestures of the hidden hand. He did not wish to expose publicly the question which would disconnect the ignorant masses. Lincoln decided to eliminate the international banker by establishing a system of loans through the allowing the states to borrow directly from the people without intermediary. He did not study financial questions, but his robust good sense revealed to him that the source of any wealth resides in the work and the economy of the nation. He opposed emissions through the international financiers. He obtained from Congress the right to borrow from the people by selling to it the bonds of the states. The local banks were only too glad to help such a system. And the government and the nation escaped the plots of the foreign financiers. They understood at once that the United States could or would escape their grip. The death of Lincoln was resolved upon. Nothing is easier than to find a fanatic to strike. The death of Lincoln was a disaster to Christendom, continues Bismarck. There was no man in the United States great enough to wear his boots, and Israel went anew to grab the riches of the world. I fear the Jewish banks and their craftiness and tortuous tricks will entirely control the exuberant riches of America and use it to systematically corrupt modern civilizations. The Jews will not hesitate to plunge the whole of Christendom into wars and chaos in order that the earth should become the inheritance of Israel, this false Israel. Facts Hidden in the American Files is the title of the next paragraph if you're writing it down. Thus does unwritten history come to light with the years again. We repeat that the above quotations from Bismarck was released to the public in 1921, some 45 years after it was written. Bear in mind also that official archives of the United States government bearing on the Civil War would not be available until 1965 or 100 years after the event. We have therefore been obliged to go to European sources to obtain the facts. End of quote.
I'm sure that about this time there's a lot of you saying, why doesn't he bring us up to date? Let's talk about the hour that we're standing in. All right, you've heard me mention about the final conflict and all of the preachers touting the time of Armageddon, but there's a lot of things lead up to it, but I think that would you allow me to go back and show you how really accurate the Bible is? And for those of you who have got my other tapes and albums, you know the promises of Solomon, many other prophets, how the Eternal would protect those that are waiting and watching for him. But I'd like to, I think we ought to probably label this the Timaroth. Let's go back and try to realize the extreme antiquity of the prophecies, which were definitely predicting future dates, such as the hour that we're living in this last generation of 40 years, when we've come to know the horrors of atomic warfare and its capabilities and such terrible things, as we saw a dry run, shall we call it a test run, that took place over in Iran. Now, or as we went against the Iraqis, I'm trying to say there, we should not overlook a statement that was made by the prophet Joel in his book. The date that Joel gives was about 800 BC, which was approximately 2,740, let's call it 2,800 years ago. Very close to that. It was 80 years before the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom. It was approximately 210 years before the Babylonian captivity of what was called then the southern kingdom. We find that these two separate and independent kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and I want you to always think Adam's kids. All right, so they weren't always called Adam's children. Adam means to be of a white, red, ruddy complexion, show red in the face when angered or embarrassed. You'll find this in both the Greek and the Hebrew lexicons. But if we could just keep our mind and follow him, even though he's had his name changed, they were called Hebrews, they were called Israelites, they were called Isaac's sons, they were called six sons, Celts, Celts, many names that we won't bother you with, but we find that these two separate nations here and independent kingdoms of what was known as Israel and Judah, then in residence at that time in the area we know as Palestine, without a thought of their approaching captivity. And here was how this prophecy went. Now we're going to quote to you from Joel's 2nd chapter, verses 30 to 31. And he says, I will show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and the terrible day of the Lord come. Now, for our Fenton Bible, one of my favorites, you heard me speak of many times, he renders it thus, and fixed signs in the sky, and on earth blood and fire and columns of smoke. Now, quite naturally, we find that our interest is centered on two words here, pillar and columns. As we note, both of them seem to be plural. Now, what about the localities and the periods and the tempo here? Locality, reading the 2nd and the 3rd chapter of Joel, there's no difficulty in fixing the locality. For verse 2 of chapter 3 reads, I will also gather all nations and will bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel. whom they've scattered among the nations and parted my land. Somebody's taken it over and divided it up and given it to other people. Now notice these past tense, which have been described as the prophetic past. The prophet is so certain of the inspiration here of these passages and its fulfillment that he describes it just like it already been accomplished. Period. At this prophecy describes the final judgment of the nations and the final restoration of all Israel. There'll be no doubt, as it describes events in the future, what I say the religious world describes as the Armageddon period, or why don't we just call it Third World War. Now, the marginal references on all points to many similar prophecies here that include the well-known Russian chapters of Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now, surely here we find these prophecies. They describe a futuristic period which I believe beyond the shadow of a doubt that we're standing in this worldwide period of distress and disaster and all-out total warfare, even exceeding the kind that we experienced in World War II. And this is going to be the time that most of these people have no clue. They don't take it to their heart, because most people don't realize that they're Jacob or any descendants of Isaac's sons, six sons, Saxons, children of laughter. When you tell them, well, don't you realize you're a descendant of Jacob, Jack, John, Jerry, Joe, Jeffrey, all of these things, if they would only look, would point them back as to who they are. But like Isaiah the prophet says in the very first chapter, he brings it out so well. He tells that the Eternal's people are blind up till the latter days, but he also prophesied that he was going to take the blindness off of his people. The ox knows his crib, the sheep know their master, but my people do not consider. But here when they're talking about this time of Jacob's trouble, they're talking about a period that would be more horrendous than any wars known to man. But he tells about the time of Jacob's trouble and that how we shall be saved out of it, not temporarily, but permanently. Now, it will, a lot of people have been lulled back to sleep. And they say, well, hey, bro, I got nothing to worry about. My preacher told me this is all going to happen over in Israel. And, hey, Russia's broke, and, gosh, they're disarming, they're getting rid of their weapons and all this. Brother, I got some land in Florida I'd like to sell you, but we'll have to wait till the tide goes out. But so we go back to sleep. But what do they mean here when they're talking about the blood and the fire and the pillars of smoke? Now we can see what the leading commentator here and expositors say about these outstanding features of this prophecy. And it's only fair for me, I got to point out to you that these commentaries that who have written on this subject, it was years before the discovery and the use of the first atomic bombs when they were used on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But we all agree that these pillars of smoke would be a prominent feature in future ruthless, immoral, I don't have words to describe it. But these are, believe it or not, these are prophecies and they're instruments of divine judgment, not of salvation by grace, as take for example this Dr. Horton in the Century Bible writes, doubtlessly the ravages of war, and he adds and says, see Ezekiel 38 and 22, which even back then the man knew and understand it links up with the Russian raid on Palestine, and America maintained the new and unwalled Jerusalem. But I believe what is going to happen there, that this world, this is beyond the scope of a lot of people's imagination. I don't mean this to be a prophecy, but I think, you see, people cannot understand these world Zionists. this egomania to rule. We're talking about some people that have been entrenched for millenniums on this earth long before the true Israel, the true Adamite, ever came to this planet. And they don't want to give it up. But those very same ones, like the scripture says, those who pierced me shall see me coming in the clouds with great glory and with a great triumphant army. But you see, the average sheep or the little lambs of God, this is beyond their understanding. They cannot see this. And I don't imagine they really want to see it. But we're talking about an adversary of the eternal who we don't want to fight. We want to get along with him. But we have not learned over the last thousands of years that you can't make a deal with the adversary who's diametrically opposed to the eternal. He's not going to give up his government. He's tolerated you and your weak constitution because at least that was way watered down from the original 10 Commandments and all of the other laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and he got all of these wimpy, soggy-headed bunch of feminine, emotional preachers up there espousing this stuff that we're not under the law. Well, hey, they did it. We're not now. That's why we have chaos in the land. But what does he mean when he returns? He's going to rule with a rod of iron. In the idiom language, that means he's going to restore law and order. But let me go back for a moment to Ezekiel 38:22. He said, I will plead against him with pestilence. Pestilence, like fallout. Go back and read about this peculiar person or nation, as she's symbolized, who said she's not widowed. Christ never died for her. And she said, I sit as a queen, and no harm shall come nigh me. But this heifer was as mistaken as they come. Because it said all her neighbors around her is going to see her and her destruction, and they won't go near her because of her plagues, her pestilence. My friends, that is talking about a fallout. This world international Zionist organizations, now that they figure that they have risen to the top and to the apex of their power, they're even going to sacrifice their own, which I maintain will be the little land of Israel. This will shock people to death. And while our eyes are over there, and a big majority of our troops, probably, who knows, maybe 90% of them, will be drawn back into the Middle East again, our men and our weapons, leaving us virtually defenseless. This is when the attack will come. But I'm getting ahead of my story. Ezekiel 38:22, and I will plead against him with pestilence and blood, and I will rain upon him and upon his bands and all of the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain and great hailstones and fire and brimstone. Now for those who have got my other tapes, he's talking about fire and brimstone. You know the old name for brimstone is sulfur. And I might point out to you that and remind you that you remember back in when the children of Israel left Egypt, it was dark. What caused all that darkness? Was it magic? Or did something of a gigantic proportion stand between the earth, the moon, and the sun? And at such an angle that only part of the earth was blackened out. And they were right on the cusp. It took some great intelligence to create that. And then we remember Joshua's long day. Something held the earth back. Might receive a few extra hours of daylight. And then from 3 to 6 o'clock in the afternoon, at the death and resurrection of Christ, it was total darkness. Now here is something coming over, and that you might find a clue in the 38th chapter of Job, where he speaks of this great space station that's covered with, like it would depend on the translation, an overcoat of clay. But as we've pointed out, the scientists say there's sulfur on the surface of Venus. Something from the inside out is being spewed out on it continuously. Why is that? How is that? But if you want to go into the chapter, it tells about these hailstones and these great cubits that are fall down on the people are like 50 foot across. And when that giant chunks of sulfur hit our atmosphere, and the great pulling from the gravitational pull of two large bodies such as Earth and what I'm predicting is Venus, something's got to fall. But the Friar Fenton, he goes on and he translates this: and I will execute upon him by disease and slaughter and pouring rain and hail of fire and rain brimstone upon him and upon his hordes and upon the many nations who are with him. For I intend to magnify and to distinguish and manifest myself to the eyes of many nations, that they may learn that I am the ever-living. Ooh, that's a hard way to meet him. That's a hard way to learn about him. I know your King James says 3/4 of the nation, as Revelation talks about the 200 million that are coming pouring into this nation. But, your King James says 3/4 of them shall be cut off. You look it up in the concordance, it says all of them. But anyway, I'm sorry, I always get ahead of my story about. But there was another remark here by this Dr. Horton that is worth noting and pointing out, as it does the natural meanings of the word the moon into blood. He writes, the moon became blood red, as we often see in the murky air of London, and he suggests the word obscured as a more understandable translation than blood red. And I say, because the moon will become obscured because this giant space station that we spoke of, that is told about in Psalm 68, this great mount, as it's described, of the 50-some different names that we've covered, who the Eternal says, I dwell in it forever. This is my house. This is what is going to obscure even the light of the moon that hour. But going back to this Dr. Wade of days gone by, he tries to help us to explain the word wonders by suggesting that portents such as an extraordinary occurrence suggestive of divine action or the nearness of the divine present, by such the day of Yahweh the Eternal is to be ushered in. Now, back a lot of you are my age and older who knew of this Dr. Core and Dr. Driver. They gave this note of comfort in their footnotes. But terrible through the day of Yahweh will be those who invoke his name will be secure. Now let's deal for just a moment here with the gathering for this Armageddon. Now Dr. Gore's commentary helps us with chapter 3. It points out that verse 2 foretells of the assembling by the Eternal of all nations for judgment and punishment. It's also predicted in great detail. For those you may want to search it out in Isaiah 66 and verses 16 to 18. And this one I've always used on people, if I hope I remember all the passages there. Where it talks about the people that eat the swine's flesh and other abominable brews. I hope to God that you're standing by your pasteurized pastor and that day who said all you got to do is pray over it. Those are the ones that always say, I got a cow turd here for you to pray over, and I want you to take the first bite, you jackass. Or let me stick a garden hose in the tank of your car and you lay hands on it and turn it into gasoline if you're such an anointed little honey of the eternal. Now, see, a gift of God is a sound mind. And a lot of these people do not have a sound mind. You see, those of you that have been able to follow me up to now, and with the background, the understanding of all of this stuff that sounds so crazy about UFOs, you see, people go along with angels coming from heaven, coming down here under Michael, the great angel, and this is God's heavenly army and host. You can see all these guys in white nightshirts, big flapping wings, and in their imagination they'll even let old Michael have a sword. And I don't know how they go about killing them in their fantasy, the enemies of the eternal. But if you give any real substance to them, even though you point out to them Revelations 19th chapter and 22nd chapter of Revelations, where John bowed down to an angel a couple different times there. The guy told him, don't do it. I'm of your household. I'm a man like yourself. These so-called angels, that's the Greek word, that had taken him to outer space, and he showed him the very temple of the eternal. But notice in this Isaiah 66, just from the King James, thus saith the Lord, the heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where's the house that you're going to build for me? Where's the place of my rest? He's watching what all is going on, and he's telling about he's going to come back. And like in the 5th verse, hear ye the word of the eternal. Ye that tremble at his word, your brethren that hated you, they cast you out for my name's sake, saith the Lord. Be glorified, but he shall appear to your joy, and they shall be ashamed. Now listen to the next verse. And a voice of noise from the city. That's great space station, the one that John visited in Revelations. Now, allow me to back up a little bit. Notice it switches from being called a city. A city is a lot of people. And I've pointed out to you before, let me refresh your memory. And I don't mean to be insulting, but we've covered a lot of real territory. In the ancient times, the Chinese, Babylon, the Greeks, they referred to planets out there as cities. Then it goes on, it said a voice, meaning a spokesman, where? From the temple, this space station that was called a temple, called a tabernacle. In the 6th verse of Isaiah 66, a voice from the temple, a voice from the Lord that rendered recompense to his enemies. Now, get the next parable, 7th verse. Before she travailed, she brought forth. See, like the Greeks called Venus, they called it the goddess of love. Well, you see, you got to remember now, when John was there, it talked about all these beautiful people they were adorned. The people adored this temple. They adorned the city like a bride. Now, it's talking about Venus in the female sense. Before she travailed, she brought forth. Before her pain came, she was delivered of a man-child. Now, a lot of people will say that this is referring to Christ. I believe it's very possible, reporting of a day that she come forth, the Messiah came, Yahshua the Messiah came here, was rejected by many. But we'll leave that alone. Let's go to the 15th verse. For behold, the Lord will come. Now it's talking about when he comes back again. Will come with fire, with his chariots, like a whirlwind, to render his anger, with fury, with his rebuke, with flames of fire. For by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord will be many. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh and the abomination of malice, and etc. He says they're going to be consumed. But the 18th verse, just quoting it in part there, and they shall come and see my glory. And then he talks about in the 19th verse, all those that are islands afar off, he says, that have not heard my name and my glory among all these Gentiles. And then, like Revelation tries to tell us, and the people that have never understood the very last of this chapter, and they shall bring all their brethren for an offering unto the Lord out of all nations, horses and chariots and litters, upon mule, upon swift beast, to my holy mountain, Jerusalem. Jerusalem's not a mountain over there in Israel. It's talking about his government, his great mountship. Revelation talks about it. You've heard me quote of that before. Going into the holy city. Hey, Jerusalem has been so contaminated. Don't tell me that's holy. Or you and I just don't understand holy. But he talks about to my holy mountain. Jerusalem, saith the Lord, as the children of Israel bring an offering in a clean vessel into the house of the Lord. Once again, I revert you back to Psalm 68. Go read the last part of the chapter. He dwells in a mountain. That's his house forever. Don't tell me he's over there in Israel now. And it goes on just like Revelation, verse 22. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. In other words, there's a day, an hour coming when it says we'll be caught up to meet him, we'll be with him, we'll get to go to... I'm not talking about no rapture, post-rapture, millennial rapture, after raptured, none of this. Hey, you're going to go through it, because we have stood by while all of these our fellow Americans committed all of these horrible deeds and sins, and I'm afraid we were guilty because we didn't cry out, we didn't take action against it. So, hey, we're going to get it with them. But, verse 23, it shall come to pass that from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord, and they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me, for their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they will be an abhorring unto all flesh. Well, I got a little farther out there on my tangent than I intended to, but you might want to, if this intrigues you, you want more information, you want to see what's going to happen, go to Micah, the 4th chapter, 11 and 13, and check out Zephaniah, 3rd chapter, 8th verse, and the sectional headlines in the Scofield Reference Bible in Micah 4, 11 to 13. Read how the kingdom is set up, the gathering of the Gentiles, so-called, or nations. I know there's a lot of you out there that don't like Scofield, and a lot of people say, oh, he was a Jew, and he was this, and he was that. I don't care what he was. He made a lot of mistakes, but there's still some very interesting things that he put in there, especially in his reference to pre-Adamites and so forth, that woke up an awful lot of people. But in there it speaks of the Gentile nations that are against Jerusalem, and it speaks of the battle of Armageddon, Revelation 16, 14, and 19, and 17. Armageddon immediately seems to precede the setting up of the Messianic kingdom as a heading there for Zephaniah 3 and 8, and the Scofield suggests the judgment of the nations, and refers us to Zechariah 14th chapter 1 to 21 with these headlines, or headings, I mean to say, summary of events at the return of the Almighty in glory, Armageddon, the visible return in glory, physical changes here that they're pointing out in Palestine, the kingdom set up on earth, and the worship and the spirituality of the kingdom. Now, the physical sense refers to the great earthquake, which will make Jerusalem a lot of people believe is the central seaport of the world. But I do not believe that, because this is hogwash that has been perpetrated on us by churchianity. It was a great puzzlement to me until I give the Holy Spirit the credit who guided and directed me to the fact I would say to you, go back to that album where talked about the resurrection of Yahshua the Messiah, where and his crucifixion, where it told about the curtain of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom, and it talked about Mary and the Mary Magdalene, and it spoke of the Roman soldier. They said that they saw all of these awesome things as they stood afar off. They watched the crucifixion at the Golgotha. And then how in the world did they see the duality of the curtain of the temple being torn in two off in... Hey, the only temple around then that was being used was Herod. And you remember that low-down rat was the one that killed all those 2,000 Israelite children, the innocents as it was called. And do you really think that he was keeping all of the Hebrew Old Testament holidays? He was a fraud. He was a fake. He was one of those that Yahshua said, you sat in the seat in the place of Moses. You have usurped that seat. You have no right to it. He was an Edomite. They say, well, he was half Jew. Well, he was half Edomite, too. And if he was such one of God's little honey, why did he murder 2,000 of God's little Israelite honeys? Huh? Now, so that if you'll go get your concordance out, go back and listen to that tape, get your Strongs out. It was the clouds that Job spoke of that hide and disguise Venus, this temple in the sky, this house. And it's when that is divided, the doors open up, the clouds roll back, and then you see the eternal returning with his great heavenly host that said, in the clouds of glory. Now, dealing with the pillars of the columns of smoke, we now reach our final section of inquiry and exposition here. I want to apologize for the length of my pontificating introduction here, but I suggest it is very necessary to go back and rehash some of these things and to steep ourselves in the great drama that is described, that is to unfold in the day of the return of the Almighty, the ever-living, as foretold by the prophets, and their idiomatic language as describing the horrors of total all-out electronic sophisticated warfare that has not been known in our written history, that is going to affect all the nation, and was previously, as we were previously led to suspect that there might be more than one type of pillar that's mentioned in the Hebrew and the Old Testament. And we take, well, for example, if you have a Young's Analytical Concordance, and you'll be rewarded by the following discoveries. Well, I prefer actually Strong's is much better. But that's one way that you might build up your confidence and evidence in the fact that what Joel gives us here as he attempted to describe the atomic bombs as pillars of smoke, the concordance shows us that the word pillar or pillars occur 109 times in the Old Testament, and there are 8 different Hebrew words, all translated into one single English word, pillar or pillars. Now, the author of the pillars, and I'm talking about here, here's the list. The second word in capitals is the Hebrew word for Young's Concordance, followed by the most accurate translation. Number 1, pillars. O-M-E-N-O-T-H. Omenoth. Pillars. Is once in 2 Kings 18 and 16. Number 2, pillars. Misad. M-I-S-A-D. Support. Once in 1 Kings 10 and 12. Number 3, pillar. M-A-T-S-T-S-E-B-A-H. It's a thing that is set up, he describes as a standing pillar. It occurs 14 times and includes Jacob's stone that he put up or built at Bethel, which is a type and an allegory of things which were shown to him, which existed in heaven or outer space, if you like. Now, number 4, pillars, M-A-T-S-U-Q, in the Hebrew, and it says anything fixed, a fixture. I was not watching the tape again. I was off in La La Land. Number 4, the pillars, M-A-T-S-U-Q. Anything fixed, a fixture, that's used once in 2 Samuel 2 and 8. This refers to the foundations, the pillars of the earth. And I won't go into all that, what it means, breaks it down, do some research on your own. But number 5, pillar, is another name here is Natsab, N-A-T-S-A-B. It means to be set up, once in Judges 9 and 6. Then number 6, pillar, Netsab, N-E-T-S-I-B, a monument. Once in Genesis 19 and 26, it refers to Lot's wife. Now, was it a monument to her and her stupidity, her not trusting the eternal? Was it her going back and being melted like a fried egg, or like what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? I really think so, and I think this is speaking of these pillars and what they can do, and we're talking about an extraterrestrial weapon of what we've shown in other chapters. As you look in the Hebrew, the word the Jews still use today, Holocaust, which means judgment by fire, and both Christendom and Judaism, and I believe some of the other pagan religions say that the final judgment of this earth will be brought about by fire. But anyway, number 7, again, pillar. You see, my friends, do you get the idea how we have been deceived? We go along and we read pillar, 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 pillar. And did your pastor, your teacher, I hope they did, I know there's some good teachers out there, but did they ever tell you that, hey, you better look up and see what was translated pillar? And so, you see how much we have missed? Pillar. Number 7, Amud, A-M-M-U-D, a pillar or column used 32 times in Exodus, 57 times elsewhere, usually in connection with the tabernacle or the temple. Now, you got to remember, I know years ago when I was a young man, I was getting ready to pontificate and to lead a class in a seminary. I was quite surprised. I got to looking and I realized there was a great difference between temple and tabernacle. In many places where it said temples, that it was changed, and it didn't always mean the same thing in the same place. And what we have to remember, if we can just go back a lot of this, especially, as some of you have heard me say before, on the when it talks about the temple or the tabernacle and all of the things, and it's one of the longest, most misunderstood parables in the whole Bible. And some of you have heard in other albums, I believe, along with a lot of other learned, forgive me, I don't mean to sound braggadocio, but there are a lot of learned people in Europe, and especially England, from old books that I'd got it from, that they believe beyond a shadow of a doubt that the original tabernacle was round. Just like you find so many synagogues today are round and have a rounded dome in them. But, as I said, I believe it's been tampered with. And so you find a little different description. But these things and the temple and the tabernacle, remember the Eternal, when he handed down the plans from heaven or outer space, they told him to build these things exact. that these were a parable, they were a type, they were a shadow, they are an allegory of heavenly things, so that we might understand if those who would diligently search it out. Now, number 8, pillars. Now we come to the magic one. Timaroth means like a palm tree. Pillars, used only twice in the Old Testament, once in Joel 2:30 and once in the Songs of Solomon 3 and 6. This, of course, would send you to the Song of Solomon, and we read how the shepherdess looks out and sees the approaching of Solomon's cavalcade, and the all-important point is that these pillars of smoke were shaped like palm trees. Young's, and I like Strong's better, literal translation of the Bible reads, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness like palm trees of smoke?" Truly, there's a strong link up between Joel and Solomon, and when we discover that they both use the same Hebrew word, Timaroth, Joel used it over 200 years after Solomon, and he selected it because it described the shape of this pillar of smoke. It would not be possible to use a more perfect, shall we say, description of the word of the pillar of smoke caused by the explosion of, say, a hydrogen bomb, atomic bomb, whatever. Every illustration or that you have ever seen, how it was used in the Pacific and the atoll of the, the Bikini Islands, as a witness to the accuracy of its description. And Joel's prophecy dates their use as being used at Armageddon. And the camouflage of this inspired prophecy is complete until the time arrives for its fulfillment and its acknowledgement. Now, there's a great many people. In fact, I'll be quite frank with you. I've lost quite a number of people, listeners along the way. But I don't worry about that. The Scripture itself says some get 10, some 20, some get 40%, some 90, some 100. And we hear about the parables of the sower that went to sow the good seed and so forth. Well, that has many connotations. But the seed was, some of it was dropped on shallow ground. A lot of people are very shallow. I don't know whether that's due to the outside influence of their peers about them and their eternal fear of losing their health, wealth, and their gewgaws and their baubles and their plastic Taiwan and Japan toys. But then some people, it's just like trying to plant seed on rock. The birds come along and eat it up. You know, and a lot of times I used to laugh back in the old-timey Baptist church. I used to sing a song, "Oh, that great speckled bird." And they had no idea that it was talking about, like in the Hebrew, the mamzar, a bastard, a great, symbolically a great mongrelized bird that was going to devour them. But anyway, that's another story. But the reason my point is what I'm trying to make here is that I've lost a lot of people along the way is because I can't get those, any of it that was raised on a farm. You know how the old mules, they had these blinders on either side of their eye so they couldn't look to the right or left. It blocked out their peripheral vision, and all they could do was look straight ahead to what they were plowing. Well, a lot of people, they resent it if you try to take those things off of them so that they can get a broader scope of the great panorama of the eternal as to what is going on and what will happen, because the Scripture says there has nothing's happened that shall not happen, that has not happened, will not happen again. Well, I really messed that up. But you get the whole point. Everything seems to go in circles and cycles, and what bothers a lot of people, they have been so brainwashed with this just a spooky God that is not real. He doesn't have a real form. And then a lot of them get mad if you equate him, the eternal, to Yahshua, the Messiah, coming incarnate. Like, doubting Thomas said, I got to put my fingers in his wounds. So you try to put the fingers in the wounds of the Christ, the Yahweh incarnate, as the prophets of old prophesied his coming and laying aside his flesh, making himself a little lower than the angels, down to the level of us carnal earth men. But anyway, this kind of blows them all away, you know. But anyhow, I try to tell people about this eternal deity, the one, the only, the creator of all the universes, all the sidereal system. And I try to say, hey, look here, I want you to meet your Father. Well, does not compute. That's not the Father they've been taught about. They don't know who he is or what he's like. And if you try to break it down, make it simple for them, they can't stand that, I guess. But I guess another thing that they can handle is the fact that he is out there in space, and the Bible talks about his watchers, these big watcher ships and satellites. My goodness, even the Egyptians talked about Horus. He had an eye in the sky, and he rode around the flying shields, and they admitted, and all of the Aztecs, Toltecs, Mayans, Incas, tribes, races, nations of people that we never heard of, that they acknowledged that there was a superior, super intelligence that had his eye on this earth and watched man as he evolved mentally, maybe spiritually, I don't know. We keep sliding back. But let's just cut all this nonsense out, and I'll try to cut it down to the point where from heaven the Almighty turns the world literally upside down. Did you know he did that? And also, let's go into Joshua's long day. You never heard a preacher in modern day ever speak on that. But let's show you how wonderful and fantastic when he interfered in the day of Joshua and gave him victory over his enemies. You say, what's this got to do with prophecy? Well, he told him ahead of time he would do these things. And so it might encourage you and realize, like Elijah's servant when he had his, hey, you explain it to me. Elijah prayed that this guy that was following him around, Elisha, wasn't it? And he was just scared skinny because all the great armies of the ruling powers, guys, he was surrounded by the CIA, the FBI, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, and they called in United Nations troops, from the other nations that were in agreement with them. They were about to come down on poor old Elijah and Elisha. And this servant, man, I mean, I can hear it now. I can hear his knees knocking. And he said, they're going to kill us, Elijah. But he said, I'm going to pray. He said, ask the Eternal. He said, please take the blindness off of him. He says, so that he might see your heavenly armies. And so I don't know what transpired, whether it was a third God-eye mind that opened up, but he was allowed to see in a higher dimension. He was able to see at a vibratory rate, another dimension or something right here parallel with our dimension, or maybe the armies, the ships of Yahweh, I believe that they're in such an advanced state and they have such a technology that although they're here, they can literally make themselves invisible. It is scientifically and mathematically possible. But after he was allowed to see whatever was brought about, I know it was scientific, that really upsets a lot of people. They like the esoteric and spiritual juju, as the churches have taught them, but whatever, it was accomplished, and the follower, his disciple, he said, there are more that be with us than those that be against us. He said, I can see the chariots of God. And he described them seemingly without number. So he was quite encouraged. So maybe we ought to pray that we could get our third eye, God-eye mind, whatever you want to call it, or that we have that ability that we could look and have some faith. But in the meantime, the best that I'm able to offer is show you a couple of very climatic things that happened in recorded history, but most of you have never ever been made aware of it. And let's start with the day that our earth turned over. Now, many folks are not aware of a fellow by the name, a professor by the name of C.A.L. Totten, Totten. He wrote a lot of books, I believe, that, let me double check here. I had to stop and look up a couple of his books. I have a series of little books that have been put together that started in the late 1800s, 1901 and up. And you talk about our forebears being intelligent people. These men took the time and the effort to sit down and learn the Hebrew and the Greek and the Latin, and many of them knew several languages. And so they went back and they did not just go down and buy, the happy good news for modern man and just sit there and get all full of joy and emotional teary-eyedism. They got their books out, they did their homework, they did their research, they devoted their lives to this. This was not 45 minutes on Sunday. But this Professor Totten, he was probably one of the most brilliant men of our time or our century. And in the introduction of his book, he wrote about Joshua's long day and the dial of Ahaz. And he went on to say there was never a day in which earnest Bible study was more necessary than at the present one. For he thought that, you see, the times, this is what really gets a lot as we go awry, because we think that we're the last day people, we're God's little honey, and every generation thought that Bible was just talking to them. They would even take the letters of Paul and Silas and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and all these other, and everybody would take events that had either happened or that were going to happen in the time of the prophets, and they would make it applicable to their day or in the next half century or whatever, and these things did not come to pass. And so naturally, a lot of people picked these up and read these things and saw that it did not come to pass. And so therefore, they figured that they were false prophets, and they became discouraged and put it aside. But Totten, he thought that the people of his day, that they were the ones that was going to go through this Armageddon, and he also thought it was their rich harvest time, and that they were standing ready there for the reaping. Now, most of the religious people are literally afraid to investigate the Bible, and well, it may be that the canons of the higher criticism are there to guide their study. Now, most of the laity consider it beyond their sphere, even so far as Moses and the prophets are concerned, that even the clergy almost entirely neglects them. We hear it every day. These people that say, well, praise the Lord, I'm just a New Testament Christian. And you try to say that the Old Testament is about prophecy, and the New Testament is a lot of that prophecy fulfilled, but yet I believe there's as much prophecy in the Old Testament nearly as the New Testament that is yet to be fulfilled. So we have a rich mine of information that is truly concealed in our Bible, and I believe that it's right there and it's ready to be revealed if we only took a diligent study of the Word of the Eternal. And as a result of several years of intensive study, thank God, and close calculations by people like Professor Totten, who succeeded in identifying the conjunction of the sun and the moon and what really occurred at the time of Joshua's long day. Now, he was to vindicate the accuracy of the recorded account that was laid down in Scriptures, that a lot of these people that always rush to the forefront and are the first to ridicule the Eternal's Word. So now as we understand that they fled before Israel in the plains of Betharon, that the ever-living, he sent great stones upon them from the skies of Rekah, and more were killed by the stones that hailed down than the children of Israel slew with the sword. Now here I maintain, I'm trying to give you a clue as to what happened. Now, I would really not recommend that you have any new people sitting there. If you're trying to take them into deeper waters, deeper truth, do not have them sit there and listen to it, because the only thing that you and I are going to convince them of without the previous homework We can only convince them that we're total squirrels. But once again, I would remind you that as the children left Egypt, what caused that darkness? Something came between the earth, the moon, and the sun that caused a partial great eclipse that was to cast a shadow over the predominance of Egypt, but yet there was light unto the path of the Israelites. And as I have maintained for a long time about the days of Joshua, that there was extraterrestrial intervention. And as we have pointed out through Psalm 68 and 50-some different places, going into literally hundreds of times through all these tapes, trying to prepare you for the fact that the Venus actually is a great satellite that is covered over. Because where else, unless something coming into such close proximity to this earth, as we're going to see, the great catalytic upheavals that it created, and what even caused this earth to totally roll over and cause it to wobble in its orbit so badly, which has been straightening up over the last few generations. Where did these stones out of the sky come from? Were they stones or were they rocks by the translator and put the ET on the rocks, the rocket? Okay, what was that when these two extraterrestrial messengers, they're called in the Hebrew, translated angel, probably in the Bible of a lot of those that listen, when they went into Sodom and Gomorrah and they told the mayor of that city, Lot, you better, well, you know the whole story, but he got out of there barely with his family, and the guy told him, on such and such a day, at such and such a time, we're going to mash the button. Hey, you got to be pretty accurate. You must know that you are going to trigger the time bomb, that you're going to push the rocket button, that you're going to burn the town up. And it's in evidence over there that those rocks, I even had some Jewish people that I knew that went over there, and they didn't give a darn about Christianity or Christ one way or another. It meant nothing to them. And so they had nothing to gain by trying to placate me with what they knew about the Bible and what in reality happened over there. And they said, well, the location that they gave where it is, and then they talked about the other side of the Dead Sea, and they said, we saw rocks. Even one of them that had a little boy with him said, I saw rocks that were melted. And he said, he says, some sort of atomic type blast could create these isotopes and trinitopes and melt rocks like glass. So my question is, where did these rocks that come out of heaven, where did they come from? Unless, like we've quoted Job, I believe the 38th chapter, and it talks about the house of the eternal. It talks about he disguised it, hid it with clouds, cloud layers. It's been prophesied in the apocryphal books and our Old Testament. Now the scientists have come up with it. That's why they had to use an infrared camera trying to break through those layers of cloud covers. But the eternal only allowed them to get about 10% of the pictures that they wanted, because there was whole phases as it moved around and over the surface of this so-called Venus, the so-called sister planet, as we have ignorantly and erroneously called it. And so they were only allowed to film so much of it. But we see that there is layers, well, like Job said in 38, covered with an overcoat of clay, well, depending on which translation you read. So keep that in mind, that this planet coming into close proximity, that there was rocks that were loosened from it, or else they were rockets. Now continuing on. So we see here, get this picture of Israel and the plains of Beth Horon, and the ever-living here is sending these great stones upon them from the skies of Azareka. And more were killed by the stones, it says here, that hailed down than from what the children of Israel slew with the sword. Now Joshua also, he called out to the ever-living on that day. He said, O Yahweh, give the Amorites to the face of the children of Israel. And he added, Son, in the eyes of Israel be still at Gibeon, and the moon, and the valley of Ailan, Ailan. And the sun and the moon stood still till the nations had mastered its foes. Now, my friends, we know the sun is not in orbit. It's in a fixed spot, and it's revolving, and we revolve around the sun, and know, well, like the moon. So I say, what held the earth back? What held the moon back? What held them in the position? Was it, as I maintain, this great house of the eternal, called the temple, called the holy city, called the rock by Daniel, called Bethel by Abraham, who said in former greater times it was called Luz, and we can go into what Job said, and on and on and on. But in other words, a great space station that could be moved, as the Indians, Aztecs, the Toltecs, the Peruvian Indians, recorded in their history, like the Babylonians, like the Egyptians, who talked about it disappearing and leaving its orbit, and it could move in any direction that it wanted, depending on which way they saw, like the great pillars of like fire and smoke coming out of the bottom or the top, depending on which direction that they were going. So when you get something engineered of a size equivalent to this earth, of that great power, and of that great magnitude, and of those great advanced dignitaries, as we shall call them. This is one translation of the ancient Elohim in Psalms 68, wherein it said, and the Lord arose, or God arose. But if you look it up in the Hebrew, it was Elohim, and it meant the great dignitaries. Well, don't be offended by that I'm not taking anything away from God Almighty, but He does have some flunkies under Him, if you like. We are all flunkies, and we have a pecking system and a pecking order, and like He said in that day, I'll put every man in his place, and he shall be satisfied. But it talked in that chapter about kum, it rose up, meaning to rise up. But it said, is not this recorded in the true records, that the sun stood still in the mid-sky, and hastened not to set for about a full day? Now, there has never, ever been an event like this before or since, for the ever-living to listen to the voice of one man. You realize, my friends, like Christ tried to tell us in the New Testament, if you had the faith of but a grain of mustard seed, you can say to yonder mountains, translated mountains, get thee hence, cast thyself into the sea. It was talking about go into the sea of space. Faith there, I believe if you had to know how, I got faith I can fix your car because I know how to fix carburetors, let's say, for example. That's the biggest lie that ever was. But, for example, if you had the faith, if you had the know-how, and remember the Scripture says, I hear the prayers of those who keep my commandments. That's very important when you're trying to get His attention. So if you think maybe your prayers didn't get above your bedroom ceiling, you might take a look at yourselves, as I have to every day. So, now, there's never, ever, think about this, in all recorded history, never before has they ever listened to one man like this. But remember this, my dear friends, the Almighty fought for Joshua and his men. Doesn't the New Testament say all creation's groaning in travail, waiting for the glory that shall be manifested in the sons of God? That's generic. Now, a lot of you women say, okay, I know and I understand God's laws, and I have limitations put upon me. I can't do this, and I can't do that. But I say, my dear, there's a book out called The Famous Women of the Bible. There was so many wonderful women of God that had to stand up because these men seem to have dried up. but the power of prayer and walking in His light and being an example, because the woman is the one that raises the family. The man's off trying to make a living, or at least that's the way it used to be. Now, you might want to look this up in Joshua 11-14 from the Farrar Fenton translation. If you'll permit me, on second thought, I just stopped dig my Bible out. I'd like to read to you from this lovely new Fenton Bible. Well, I've had older ones just like it, but it's a little newer. This is one that has gold-edged paper and leather cover on it. It's beautiful. Doing a little commercial. And as they fled before Israel in the plain of Beth-horon, the ever-living sent great stones upon them from the sky of Azarachah. And more were killed with the stones that hailed down than the children of Israel slew with the sword. Joshua called on the ever-living in that day. He uses, I'm ashamed to say he mistranslates Jehovah, gave the Amorites to the